Good morning from Brussels. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and it's really a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this, what is actually the fourth edition of our State of the Union's conversation. We're really delighted to have you with us here today. We're very delighted to have a wonderful set of speakers here with us today for this conversation. I'll let our moderators introduce them in a moment, but just to say a word about our partnership. We're really very pleased over the years to have had a great deal of collaboration with the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, FEPS, here in Brussels. And this series of events has really been the centerpiece for that. And so it's really a great pleasure again to be with our friends from FEPS. This has been a great conversation over the years. It's an opportunity to talk about what's going on in the world, what's going on in transatlantic relations, but also, as you'll see, what's going on in our societies on both sides of the Atlantic. And we've got a bit of all of those things, I would say, on our agenda for today. I mean, just to give you a little bit of a roadmap, we have two sessions. The first will look at the question of defending democracy at home and abroad. And the second will talk about dealing with a rising China, both obviously critical issues for our conversation today. The first session will be moderated by our friend, Vasilis Entousas, who is a senior policy advisor at FEPS. And before I turn it over to him for his session, we're going to watch a short video. So stay tuned.
All right. I hope you have all managed to see the beautiful video we have created. Good morning to the US, good afternoon from Europe. And let me also thank Dr. Lesser for his kind words. My name is Vasilis Dousas. I am the Senior International Relations Policy Advisor at FEPS. And I would also like to thank you for joining us for this first session of the fourth annual State of the Union's conference, co-organized by FEPS and GMF. Let me also give a big thanks to the wonderful team at GMF led by Dr. Lesser, but also my colleagues at FEPS who have worked tirelessly to bring this all together. So many thanks indeed. Now, I trust you've all seen the very illustrative video we just played. This video, I think, set the tone for what we are about to discuss. This session focuses on democracy, and we chose the first session of this year's conference to focus on democracy. Not just on democracy, but also on the kind of action that both transatlantic partners need to take beyond their borders, but also crucially at home, in order to tackle the challenges that our democracy and our democracies are facing. We live in a fiercely contested information environment. We see the growing winds that are blowing towards anti-intellectualism, extremism, authoritarianism. We see the appeal of post-truth politics on the rise. And we've all become painfully aware of the fact that democratic progress should not be taken either as granted or as irreversible. I should also add this all comes at an age where we all tend to operate like like-minded communities, and to operate in a system increasingly structured around echo chambers, which makes agreement not just on subjective takes, but also on objective facts very difficult. Now, the aggregate result of all this, we all know, because we see it every day. It's a hit on not only on the quality of our democracy, but also on the width and breadth of our democratic imagination. What we as citizens can hope or imagine our democratic systems to be able to deliver for our lives and livelihoods. We have a great group of people with us today to help us decode what we can do to defend democracy, what is at stake, and how we can alleviate the strength that our democracies are under. Before presenting them, I should add that due to some unforeseen last-minute changes, we unfortunately could not deliver on the very high gender balance standards that both FEPS and GMF abide by when it comes to the panel composition. It was definitely not our intention. This happened for reasons beyond our control, but nonetheless, we felt that it's important to make this point. And putting that aside, as I said, we do have a great lineup. And let me briefly introduce them. We start with Mr. Tonino Picula, who's a member of the European Parliament for Croatia from the S&D Group. Mr. Picula, welcome. Mr. Jonathan Katz, the Director of Democracy Initiatives and a Senior Fellow with GMF. Mr. Katz, good to have you. Dr. Laszlo Andor, the Secretary General of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies and a former EU Commissioner. Dr. Andor, same to you, good to have you. And last but not least, Mr. Thomas Wright, the Director of the Center on the United States and Europe at Brookings. Mr. Wright, welcome. Now, before starting, let me also say that we're very thankful that so many of you are here this afternoon in Europe and this morning in the US. We're going to go through our speakers for a first round of questions, but then we'll look forward to receiving your questions. And to do that, please use the Q&A function. If possible, flag who the question is for. Now, having said that, I should also add that the event is on the records. Feel free to disseminate what you find interesting on social media. Now, I'm going to start with my questions, and I'm going to start with Mr. Picula. Mr. Picula, we do live in an increasingly multipolar age. The democratic agenda has taken a big hit. The quality of democracy, even in the US and across Europe, has also been affected and has dropped. And of course, this is part of a larger trend affecting democratic policies and politics the world over. But it is very interesting, very telling that this trend also grew where democracy was supposed to be most securely rooted. Now, I'm wondering if you can tell us what you think are some of the new and effective foreign policy instruments and methods we can use as Europeans, as Americans, to deepen democratic values at home, but also spread them abroad. And I'm asking this because I also know that you're the Parliament's rapporteur on the future of EU-US relations. Mr. Picula, please.
Yeah. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. I do hope that you can hear me and see me, that our connections are well. If you confirm that, I can proceed. Is it okay? Okay. Once again, good afternoon to everybody in Europe, and of course, good morning to our colleagues from United States of America. If I may reply directly to your question, I would say that generally, democracy seems to be a very fragile system, and alliances whatsoever between democracies are fragile too, as we can see, drawing conclusions from certain events which took place even this summer. More than that, according to some analysis, democracy as a system is withdrawing in more than 40 countries around the world during the last 10 years. which is in a way a staggering number, and we all have to be worried. Why is that? Because especially during pandemics, of course, certain authorities claim that security must come before democracy in a way. And that serves as a so-called alibi for, first of all, extending government's extended powers of the parliaments during the pandemic. In a way, we must not turn our blind eye to that phenomenon. Regarding that, I would like also to say, you even didn't mention that word, but I think it's necessary to mention multilateralism. We are talking about multipolar world, but I think it's very dangerous if we accept that way of thinking, that the multipolar way of handling things on a global level should replace multilateralism. But multilateralism, and we are standing for multilateralism, reintegrated multilateralism, that multilateralism wasn't built in a day. It took a long time to prove its value, but at the same time, it's a very fragile way of finding common solutions. So how to defend it and even more make it more effective in a time when empires are back? It's a very popular notion that empires are back, taking more ground from the full-fledged democracy. And referring to your question, some concrete action we should do could be, in a way, I think, communicating better with and between citizens on both sides on the enduring importance of the transatlantic bonds and its relevance today. Even though our conference of the future of the Europe, which is in ongoing process, some experiences can be drawn by the US too. More than that, establishing together with the US a transatlantic alliance to defend democracy globally and devise a democracy defense toolkit, which should include joint action on sanctions, anti-money laundering policies, rules on the conditionality of economic and financial assistance, international investigations, and support for human rights activists and defenders of democracy. Also, better exchange between the lawmakers on the both sides of Atlantic and sharing experiences and proposals on challenges and best practices. As uneasy as it is for both sides, we cannot address these problems if we don't engage in regulating big tech too. We need to develop close cooperation in the field of cybersecurity, and at the same time, the European Union needs to develop more efficient cyber capabilities to bolster its ability to defend itself against the cyber threats. Commission's new cybersecurity strategy is a good basis for the setting of international norms and standards of the cyberspace. And I wanted to raise the issue of elections, as the protection of democratic and electoral process is a matter of global security. Both EU and the US should promote closer and more ambitious international cooperation on election observation, jointly with all relevant partners in order to counter growing public security threats to electoral process and jointly develop a structured framework for responses to interference in the electoral process. In addition to that, we need to jointly counter growing phenomenon of fake domestic election observation, which undermines public trust in election observation overall, and to assess in depth the opportunities, challenges, and risks involved in the growing use of the new electoral information and communications technologies. And lastly, I truly appreciate everything that both GMF and the FEPS do on this matter, but I also want to emphasize the need to go beyond our institutional frameworks. As a member of INGE committee, I'm following closely the topic of disinformation as a significant threat to democracy and public security. It has detrimental influence on democracy, the rule of law, and fundamental rights.
Many thanks, Mr. Piccola. Of course, I should recognize the fact that you are a member of the special committee that the Parliament has set up on foreign interference in democratic processes in the EU, which includes disinformation. And you certainly hinted at the fact that this is an expansive agenda that both transatlantic partners need to put forward. One cannot isolate a slice of that. They all need to come in a comprehensive package, from actions at the citizens level through big tech all the way to elections. Because ultimately, it's not just election integrity that's at stake or under attack, it's also information integrity. Many thanks for this initial intervention. Now, let me turn to an American voice, and let me turn to Mr. Katz. I mean, we all know that there is a high degree of interconnectedness between what's happening in the US and what's happening in Europe. But in light of the focus of the elevated role that the Biden administration, the president himself has attached to the issue of democracy, I was thinking if you could tell us how you think the US should approach internal democracy issues within the EU. I'm asking this because Mr. Piccola talked about a toolkit. A first concrete occasion on which we can try as transatlantic partners to come together is the announced Democracy Summit, which is happening in a couple of weeks from now. And there we saw a problematic invite list that to some observers is feared to cast a shadow on the impact of the summit. So what's your take on how the US should look at internal democracy issues within the EU, knowing that these democracy issues can be very disruptive when it comes to building a common agenda? And the standoff between Warsaw and Brussels is but the latest example of, as an obstacle of great climate ambition during COP26. But I should also add how close some EU governments with authoritarian or liberal tendencies have come to external players like China. So, Mr. Katz, what's your take on this?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with FEPS. Vasilis, thank you so much for that question, and and also to my GMF colleagues who pull this together. It's always hard to follow a politician who lays out many of the key points and challenges facing democracies globally, the trends, but also the response to that. Indeed, the Biden administration is quite focused on the democracy agenda. President Biden, even President-elect Biden, made many commitments, including holding a summit for democracy in his first year in office. That's happening in about exactly 1 month from today, with 108 countries participating, but also civil society organizations, independent media, private sector. So when we talk about democracy, even looking out from the administration here in Washington, we're talking about a much more expansive group of participants that are critical to advancing a democracy agenda. For many here in Washington, this is an important step forward. It's not only going to be one summit in December, but it will be a year of action towards democracy, but also a second summit in December of next year in 2022, hopefully in person in Washington. So these are really positive steps forward. But to address your question too, one, this administration not only is talking about democracy and democracy summits or democracy agenda, but it's also talking about the keystone to advancing that agenda, which is the transatlantic relationship. And I think you have seen, although it has been a challenging several months, depending on what issue has popped up, and the administration has been dealing with it. But clearly, the transatlantic relationship is key to advancing this agenda. Mr. Piccola just mentioned a number of initiatives that he thinks are critical to that relationship. And so when we start to talk about the challenges that we see in Europe, and particularly in several countries where democratic backsliding has occurred. And by the way, this isn't something that's happened over the last couple of years. Indexes like Freedom House, Nation in Transit has been tracking for the last decade a decline of democracy in countries like Hungary. And we've seen this happening in Turkey as well, NATO, EU allies. So it's really important issue for the United States. We've seen successive administrations, the Obama administration take one tact on democracy in Europe, more focused on punitive actions, speaking directly to the issue of democracy in countries like Hungary. And then you have the Trump administration, which took the opposite approach, which is we are not going to engage in these issues of democracy and human rights in Europe, which I believe is to the detriment to the United States and transatlantic security and interests, as we've seen backsliding move these countries further away from their democratic roots, over the last 3 decades, to a situation now where you have more autocracies or autocratic-like governments across Europe. And for many, that is of deep concern because of how that weakens transatlantic security, collective security, and then opens the door as well for malign actors like Russia or China. So this administration is clearly placed this democracy on the front burner. You're right about the list of participants. When you look at who was not included, it includes Hungary, it includes Turkey, includes Russia, Belarus. So clearly there's a signal from the administration of concern about democracy in these countries. So already the US in some respects has jumped into these very sticky conversations that are taking place in Europe, concerns about democracy internally within the EU. When you look at the US interest globally, it needs a strong EU partner to deal with challenges, economic challenges, climate change, COVID-19, and also we're talking about this world, multipolar world with China and Russia. And so I think this is a critical issue for the United States. My expectation would be that the administration approaches each country in Europe individually, but then looks at the challenges collectively. Obviously, there are differences between the administration, sees some differences between what's taking place in Poland versus that in Hungary at this moment. They are looking also at key strategic issues within Europe as well. But I think ultimately the goal is to see a Europe whole, free, and democratic as the best possible partner of the United States. But there's also concerns about the impact of these issues spreading into the Balkans, the influence of Mr. Orban in the Balkans and Central Europe, and deep concerns, I think, about how autocrats spread their messaging or work with other autocrats. And I thought Mr. Pichler mentioned some of the key issues that will be on the agenda next month. One is going to be corruption, encountering corruption, and the importance of dealing internally with corruption, both in countries, domestically and externally. This Democracy Summit is also about addressing democracy at home as it is about addressing democracy abroad, human rights, addressing cyber challenges. But there's a number of issues that I think will be addressed within the context of the summit and after. But I think this administration, and listening to President Biden say it over and over again, he feels as though that democracy has not been in focus in the way that it should be right now. And it has been to the detriment to US interests over the last decade. In some ways, I see that as a little bit of criticism, even of the Obama administration, and the failure to take head on some of these issues, over a decade ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Katz. I'm really tempted to ask a quick follow-up. So if you can be telegraphic in your answer. The urgency is there, is evident, of tackling some of these things, but what would you consider proper for Washington to do when dealing with EU and EU member states? Because, for obvious reasons, it should do something and there's an agenda it should focus on, but what would it be proper to do?
Yeah, well, one, I think the EU is in the lead on this, in EU member states in dealing with these issues. And I think the US has to be aware of the internal dynamics within the EU. The US, the administration, even in the summit this past June, is placing a lot of emphasis on its relationship with the EU in a number of areas. So tread carefully. but also the U.S. has tools at its disposal to address human rights abuses or corruption, including sanctions. And I'm not suggesting that that necessarily needs to be the tack taken, because sanctions aren't always a silver bullet to the challenges and problems. But there's also the flip side, which is increasing investment and support economically, trying to address what we see as the lack of support for civil society organizations or independent media, within regions, including Hungary, where there's a huge challenge for independent media and civil society. The U.S. can re-engage. They stepped back over a decade, about a dozen years ago, in cutting off funding or ending funding for civil society and independent media in Central Europe. A lot of us believe the United States should step back in and continue to work with pro-democracy forces within Europe, and do it in a way that bolsters democracy, builds resilience, democratic resilience, and begins to address the backsliding issues. So it can be assistance, but it could also be support for economic plans like 3Cs initiative, where the U.S. is committed to fund infrastructure projects, but really hasn't put the resources into supporting that. And that would include many of the countries where we see democratic backsliding.
Many thanks, Mr. Katz. Let me just now turn to Dr. Andor. I mean, we've heard a lot, and it's clear that American and European democracies have shown signs of exhaustion, not least in the case studies that have been mentioned. You happen to come from Hungary, a country that has experienced for long this trend of democratic backsliding, but one that I should also add has shown that it still has a very strong democratic pulse despite all the challenges. You've also worked and are working extensively on European affairs. So I was wondering if you can tell us how you think Europeans themselves can take on greater responsibility, and why not risk, in defending and promoting democratic values at home. We've heard about the standoff between Poland and Warsaw and Brussels. We also heard a lot about Hungary. So what's your take?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for the question. Of course, it's not particularly joyful to represent the most frequently mentioned country in this conversation, which is about the concerns about democratic standards and resilience. But I think this is the right discussion at the right time. And I also would like to highlight the great value of this tradition between GMF and FEPS to maintain this annual event, and in this period to put the question of democracy into the focus of the discussion. Why is this so important and timely? In my view, the reason is that for quite a long time, we just took it for granted that in North America, as well as Western Europe, democracy is stable, and it is an example for many others. The only job left is to inspire others to follow us and to help them to grow up to our standards. And now the situation clearly is different on both sides of the Atlantic. There are questions about the resilience, there are questions about the commitment to democratic values and also democratic institutions. And this analysis, which we launched, I think, is looking for explanations, but also ways to address the existing risks. If I want to connect directly with the question you raised, Vasilis, how can Europeans take on the greater responsibility in defending and promoting democratic values? I would say defending, especially at home, inside Europe, and promoting, in particular, outside. And in the European Union, the two are not too far away from each other, because we need to defend in countries which recently joined the European Union, and promote very, very forcefully in countries which aspire for joining, but still can be found outside the borders of the European Union. And the two has to be consistent with each other. Why? Because since 1993, it's an explicit requirement towards countries that want to join the European Union to meet certain democratic standards. So it's part of the so-called Copenhagen criteria. And obviously, it would be just absurd to say that at the time of entry, you have to comply with high standards of rule of law, democracy, pluralism, minority rights, and so on and so forth. But as a member, these requirements would not be so important anymore. So the EU, by ignoring these commitments, would make itself a laughingstock. So rightly, these debates in the past, I must say, 10 years have grown. And 10 years ago, at the time of the great financial crisis, the perception probably was that the European Union can be divided in a north-south dimension because of the financial problems. And somehow the EU managed to overcome this financial divide. I'm not saying, without an aftermath. But now what everybody believes is more serious is what we can call, or what appears at least, to be an East-West polarization according to democratic values. Of course, there are basically two countries in the spotlight in the so-called rule of law debate, Poland and Hungary. But I would align myself on the view that some aspects of the democratic weakening and the problems with resilience also apply, mainly through a network building, which Jonathan also referred to, that in a way the high risk, or you can even say danger, of the current Hungarian situation is the capacity to spread the recipe to build an autocratic regime, or at least a hybrid regime. So at the time of the coronavirus crisis, when we hold events, hybrid became the norm. But in political science, hybrid means something absolutely negative, and it refers to a combination of formal democracy, but in substance, dismantling all the key ingredients of democratic functioning. So, they dismantle, or at least try to dismantle, equal voting rights by voter suppression. Now, it's not unique in Hungary to have voter suppression, also in various other countries, this tendency, but it is one of the key ingredients of the so-called democratic backslidings, together with control over the media, and in Hungary, which we often discuss, it's not only the public media which is fully controlled by the government party, but they also found the ways to control as much as possible of the private media channels to large-scale corruption at an industrial scale. Another feature which we have to mention, of course, there are many countries which we call democracy and not entirely free of corruption. A certain amount of sleaze pops up all the time, but there are consequences. And there is a judiciary system with integrity that can deal with such cases. And the problem which we are witnessing in both Hungary and Poland is the undermining of the integrity of the judiciary, which basically, essentially, dismantles what we call the rule of law, i.e. that there are controls over the executive power. So in these countries, increasingly, we are witnessing the so-called hybrid system, in which the institutions which are supposed to control the executive power are controlled by the executive power very, very effectively. And this obviously represents the great danger. To conclude, let me just say something about this pair of countries, Poland and Hungary, because there are many, many similarities which could be exposed, but also the differences are important. In my view, the current legal standoff between Poland and the European Union is potentially devastating, because it can be a kind of a self-destructing tool to withdraw Poland from the system of European law or European Union law, more precisely, and continue the drift away from democratic standards of Europe. But because of the network effect and very, very heavily entrenched structures of autocratic rule, I must say that the situation in Hungary is really something unique. Obviously, the so-called sanctions policy is not only slow, but probably also insufficient. I think we also need to think about possibilities of strengthening education, strengthening the foundations of understanding democracy, also if we want people to fight for it and actively try to sustain or restore the democratic standard, and also ensure that the political democracy also delivers in economic and social conditions. Because decoupling the political development from economic and social is something, I think, which holds the danger. I think, and finally, I should say this, that it is certainly not a little local difficulty. If it was, we wouldn't discuss it, right? So I think very strongly that this is indeed a transatlantic topic. And it was rightly mentioned that the invite list of the December Democracy Summit excludes Hungary. And if you are not on the list of invitees, you're probably on the menu. And that probably is the right way this time around.
Many thanks, Dr. Ander. Now I'm tempted to ask the similar question, rather the reverse question I asked of Mr. Katz, which is, as a Hungarian, as a European, what would you expect the U.S. to do? You know, Europeans can do X, Y, Z, but what would you see Washington being able to do to help?
For example, the US can encourage the European Union institutions to take the matter seriously, because you can see in the city of Brussels this big institutional divide, that the European Parliament is very keen to address the Hungarian question, to address the Polish question, while the European Commission as well as the European Council are very, very reluctant. So in various fora where leading politicians made obviously a serious assessment and sharing a critical analysis can certainly help gaining speed.
Thank you. Clear, very clear. Now, let me turn to Mr. Wright. I mean, we've heard a lot about what the US and the EU can or should do. I also wanted to hear from you what you think could be the way through which Washington, in cooperation with Brussels, national capitals, member states, can operationalize a democracy agenda going forward.
Yeah, thank you, and it's great to be here. So just a few, a few thoughts. I mean, this is something President Biden has spoken about, obviously, quite a lot in terms of a competition between democracies and autocracies to see which system of government can best deliver at home and abroad. And I think that idea is basically right. I'm a little bit, I guess, less enthusiastic than maybe some of the others about the summit or, ways of institutionalizing this. I think, to me, really the key is that, there's so many things that we need to do to actualize that agenda. I do worry a little bit that if we get bogged down in definitional questions of who's a democracy or who isn't, or having a large sort of summit modeled on the nuclear security summit, I'm not sure, if that will necessarily yield the type of actions that we need. So I think it's helpful to have, as long as it's just one part of the puzzle, right? And it's not sort of the be all, and end all of it. just in terms of the last sort of comment you had in terms of what the EU can do and what the US can do, the way I think about this a little bit is that, we should have an attitude toward democracy in the transatlantic relationship, sort of like Trump had with the 2% number for defense spending, right? Which is, it matters to us. And if it continues to drift or there's a problem, then it will materially affect the relationship. And that will be my answer, on the Hungary point. If Orban continues, on the way in which he's headed for the next 10 years, and we see that trajectory continuing, I think that will materially affect the relationship in very deep and meaningful and negative ways for Hungary. And I think that's what Orban ought to worry about. If he thinks he can have an alliance with the United States and shred democracy at home and work with Russia and work with China, that's not going to work. I don't know how that's going to unravel, but it's not a sustainable, situation. So I think that that's the message. I think what we need to do is to be clever about posing dilemmas and choices for leaders like Orban and maybe others, to make it difficult for them, where they have to face sort of real trade-offs and issues and how they sort of navigate this. And they should be the ones, concerned about how they sort of balance all of that. And I think we can be innovative in how we do it. In terms of just how we sort of think about democracy overall, and one of the criticisms that's often posed is, well, look, you have to cooperate with countries that aren't democracies, and you have to cooperate with countries that are problematic. And that's totally true. And of course, the United States, US democracy, is in trouble, as well. And I think we ought to be sort of careful about saying there's a perfect sort of standard out there. I would say two things, though, in terms of what I think the red lines should be in terms of cooperating with non-democracies. If you take a country like Vietnam, for instance, or several others, I think what a democracy agenda means is two things. One, if you want to be a partner or ally of the United States and you're not a democracy, that's fine. There'll be lots of transactional, even strategic cooperation and shared challenges, but you cannot take sides with other authoritarian countries in a global effort to spread the tools of repression and authoritarianism, right? So Vietnam doesn't do that, right? Saudi Arabia does do that, I think, or MBS certainly has. I think that's something the Biden administration can push friends and partners from not being a part of an authoritarianism international, right, where they're sort of sharing a best practice and learning and repression and, targeting of media, journalists and civil society and the like, and being part of that sort of Putin project. And the second red line, I think, is there's, even though we'd like to see change over the long term, that there can be no serious short-term regression, right? If there's a serious regression in terms of, a massacre of civilians or targeting of the judiciary or free press or any of these, anything sort of egregious, that is also, a red line of sorts. And I think those sort of things, if we unpack all of this, I think we can get to a point where if someone looks at US foreign policy or EU foreign policy, they can say, yeah, it's not sort of a perfect realization of a fully, a foreign policy that's only looking at democracy. I mean, no one would ever suggest that, of course, because there's other interests too, but they would also conclude that it is meaningful, that we are willing to make tough choices. We are willing to pay a little bit of a price to narrow our options on occasion where we think it's important. And so I think we have to be innovative really about thinking of all the ways we can pursue this, because I think ultimately, and I'll finish on this, what we're really seeing is, two different models of ways to organize, society. And it's not just, in the foreign policy strategy domain, it's on technology, it's on sort of the rule of law, it's on freedom of speech and assembly, and all of these different issues, coercion of smaller states. And these are things that affect people very directly. So if we think about foreign policy only in terms of sort of a narrow sense of the national interest, or missing that key component of competition, that's occurring. So it is difficult. I think there are lots of limits, but I think that doesn't make it any less important or necessary.
Thank you, and thank you for being concrete. I know you recently came out with a book that talked about the pandemic as well with Colin Cow. Perhaps you can also refer to the effect that the pandemic had on this and how post-pandemic we can work together. However, I should ask you this. Indeed, it is not a luxury item. A drop in the quality of democracy affects all other policy domains, and materially so. But the way that both partners cooperate is itself the outcome of democratic politics in each side. And we shouldn't forget that 10, 11 months ago, the US had a very different administration, which was operating with a very different foreign and domestic policy creed. And while you're in Europe, and you know this better than me, we tend to celebrate the return of sanity, if I'm allowed to put it this way, with the Biden administration. I was wondering if you could tell us whether you think we should be well advised to prepare for what happens when there is a change in the administration, perhaps other voices backed by a different party return. Because this agenda, if it is to be operationalized efficiently, it has to have longevity. It can't be the feature of one administration.
Yeah, it's a super important point. And, one thing that makes me a little bit nervous is when people define democracy as sort of a wish list for whatever their political party wants, domestically. And, there are many things the Biden administration is pushing for, that I would support on sort of the democracy agenda at home. I do think we have to be careful about identifying that as the sole sort of definition of democracy internationally as well, right? Because, as you say, the pendulum shifts. So I think, to me, when we talk about foreign policy, we're talking really about a core set of democratic features. Now, one of those unquestionably is not trying to overturn the election in an attempted coup, right? So we can agree on that. I think others are sort of hazier and fuzzier. And I think one thing that we need to try to do is to preserve as much as possible bipartisan support for the idea of democracy internationally. And because I think, exactly to your point, that's the only way in which it's sustainable over the medium to long term. And so I think that's something maybe we need to look more closely at. On the pandemic, always happy to talk about the book, so thank you for that. But yeah, look, I think the pandemic created a real need for extra sort of surveillance technologies and for the means of sort of control domestically for public health reasons. And those capacities can be, and in some cases have been, misused for other purposes. And so we have a chapter in the book on the challenges to democracy that occurred during the pandemic, and the way in which some of these tools can be adapted by wannabe sort of authoritarians or illiberal politicians for their own ends. And so I think, as we come out, hopefully, of the pandemic, it's incredibly important to ensure that as much as possible is sort of reversed, right? That we don't sort of normalize some of these tools, that they are important in a real moment of crisis, but we need to have real safeguards on it. And I think, to the point that other speakers are making, in particular cases around the world, there may be room for some pressure to be brought to bear to ensure that liberties are upheld.
Many thanks, Mr. Wright. We have about 25 minutes for the Q&A. Before doing that, I just have one last question for Mr. Picula. I mean, we did the round. We've heard a lot. And I should add that since you're the rapporteur of the Parliament's reports on the future of US-EU relations, I'm just wondering, and given the fissures that Dr. Andor referred to in between the Parliament's position and then the Commission and the Council's position on some of these issues, I'm wondering if you can reflect and perhaps extract for us, distill for us one thing that if you were to sit down with the Biden administration, we would say, this is it, this is the crux of the problem, and we need to focus on that. So how would you prioritize the implementation of the democracy agenda, which we all agree is critical for the future of the transatlantic partnership?
Thank you for asking me that question. If I sit with the President of United States and debate an issue for our priorities in a way, I would start with something he said recently to underline importance of his approach. I would like to remind all of us, he said that he would lead foreign policy for the middle class. I think it's very important, not just a slogan, but in a way, core of the political philosophy. I'm professor of sociology. As a sociologist, I could not agree more with this Biden's approach that foreign policy, in a way, is a tool for upgrading position of the middle class in a democratic society. There is a clear link between economic perspective of the middle class and the state of democracy. We are talking last 1 hour here. One is not possible without the other. However, we need to do it for the benefit of the global middle class, not for the American middle class, not only within our societies. And I wish to underline that we need to break down the myth that every stability is a good, for example. We should no longer sacrifice stability for democracy. What I would like to say, this is particularly true for our eastern neighborhood of European Union, from Eastern Partnership to the Southern Partnership. And we witnessed the brutal images from the Polish border, for example, where humans are misused in so far the most direct way by dictators who risk their life to attack our values in a way. So we must do more to protect democracies and strengthen the institutions in a way. So I think what President Biden said in his speech, that foreign policy should serve the interest of the middle class, can be expanded on the broader scene and take it very seriously when talk about situation within the European Union, especially within some problematic countries. We try to analyze situation so far in this panel.
Many thanks, Mr. Picula. Again, thank you for being concrete and clear. Now, I can see that our audience is already starting with their questions. Let me start with one by Mr. Stefan Liebig. That's addressed to Mr. Katz and Mr. Wright. He says, in the past, the West, aka the democracies, did win the Cold War because of the economics and the promise of a better life for the people. Precisely on Mr. Picula's point, shouldn't we do more about delivering for the middle class and decrease inequality to strengthen our democracies? Quick comment on that. It's intuitive, but very difficult to operationalize. Mr. Katz, let's start with you.
Yeah, and I it's really important, and income, economies, jobs, really important. Biden administration just had a pretty significant victory this past week in terms of an infrastructure package domestically, and so certainly part of the promise for middle class and attaching it to foreign policy is an economic way forward, and that means also addressing COVID-19. Globally, not just in the United States, in Europe. When you look at vaccination numbers, it's not acceptable, and that needs to be addressed. Climate change as well, which is something that was on the top of everybody's agenda at the recent meeting, is also critical. So I couldn't agree more with that connection. And I did want to say that I think I would sort of disagree. I think that the administration in Washington is very focused on addressing the economic challenges and income inequality across the United States as a means to strengthen the United States and to strengthen democracy here. Now, getting that agenda done and getting things passed through when you have a 50-50 Senate and a very tough political situation is a very different, is a different ball game. But I think the administration is very much focused on that. We'd like to see the same thing in Europe as well in terms of that agenda, but this is global as well. And if we don't meet the challenges globally on COVID-19, as we've seen with pandemics, then it can come back to seriously impact economies in the West, even with the best laid plans.
Many thanks, Mr. Katz. Mr. Wright, certainly the pandemic element here is very important and adds to the urgency.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I very much agree with, I very much agree with that, I think, and I think, the inequality piece is incredibly important to tackle, but I do think we ought to be a little bit careful about sort of putting it in the context of, the reason there's sort of populism here is there lack of inequality, or lack of equality, and addressing that is the way to sort of strengthen democracy. That correlation doesn't really exist in Europe, as far as I know. If you look at, countries where populism is strong, it doesn't sort of correlate well, I think, with the degree of inequality. If you look at several sort of Scandinavian countries that are amongst the most equal in the world, we do see pretty strong strands of populism. So I think there's a broader challenge here, as well, that I think is possibly less economic, actually, in terms of the problems we're having. I don't quite know exactly, what those are. Obviously, many different hypotheses have been offered to it, but when I look at the Build Back Better agenda or the increased sort of spending here, I favor that for domestic reasons. I think that's incredibly, important to do. I'm not sure how much I think just analytically that is sort of part and parcel of strengthening democracy at home. Although, as I said, I do think it's an important, set of priorities. On the pandemic piece, I completely agree that globally, we have a rapidly narrow window of opportunity, closing window of opportunity to vaccinate the world before we see, I think, the variants, become really even more endemic than they are, and having sort of a negative effect over the long term. And I worry a lot about sort of a division in the world between the safe zones and unsafe zones, and justifying that on public health grounds, but having that cut across, geoeconomic, geopolitical, and even sort of national and ethnic lines. And I think that will detrimentally impact the type of world that we're going to want to live in. And so I think it's important for leaders, more than they have been, at the G20 in particular, and in inclusive forums, to think strategically about what world do we want to get back to, or what world do we want to create, and then what do we do to get that to that point. And if you look at something as, like travel, for instance, that conversation has really never happened yet. Now, there has been real progress in the United States on it, I think, in the last couple of months, and we saw that happen yesterday with the opening of the borders again. But where is, over an 18-month period, where has the international coordination been on trying to really align sort of travel policies with a view to the type of openness that we want to return to? So I think these are questions I think that leaders are going to have to seriously sort of engage in at a multilateral level.
Many thanks, Dr. Andor. Perhaps quickly on the issue of inequalities, which I know is a topic that you've worked extensively on, and how that relates to foreign policy or domestic policy of democracy promotion or deepening.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, I think equality rather is the key point here, because the core of the democratic principle and mechanism is the political equality, the fact that, at the ballot box we are all supposed to be equal. And historically, if you look at the evolution of this, the political equality was also developed in order to compensate for economic and social inequalities, and to find a way to balance out opportunities in society, which otherwise would be very unequally distributed. And if this function of democracy cannot be performed, of course, many people will not be so committed or keen to maintain or insist on the democratic structures. And sometimes, indeed, this is what we observe, that if inequalities are allowed to grow disproportionately in a certain period, especially when the democratic institutions are still relatively new, then the perception which is created is that the democratic system is exactly introduced to create these inequalities. Of course, this is not the case, but if the perception is created and there is no way to sort out them, then of course we do have a problem, which is not only which you cannot deal with purely through explanation and education, but you have to tackle the material side as well.
Thank you. We have a second question that I think is very incisive, perhaps a little bit simplifying the facts, but it is very important. Henrik Larsen is asking about irregular migration. He says, the perception of uncontrolled irregular migration led to the election of Trump and Brexit, and it strengthened a liberal government's grip on power in Poland and Hungary. France may be up next for a right-wing victory in 2022. Can open borders and extensive right to asylum be reconciled with liberal order? We may disagree with the realities that Henrik described, but nonetheless, it is a very interesting, very timely question, not least because the French election is ahead of us. I'm going to do a round because, conscious of time, we have about 10 minutes. I'm going to do the round in the reverse order, the way we started. Perhaps we can, you can intervene on that question, all four of you, and then add whatever thoughts you might have on the way forward. Mr. Wright, let me start with you.
Yeah, it's a super important and difficult question, and I think one that, if we're sort of honest about, is a very hard one to grapple with. And I think the experience of Germany in 2015, we did see a major political effect to that in the subsequent German election. But it's interesting, just in the case of Germany, in the more recent election, the AfD support did not increase, it declined, a bit. And I think it's, so I don't quite know how to sort of think about this. I guess my sort of gut reaction is that it's the key part of it. Henrik's question is sort of perception of uncontrolled, right? So to the degree to which there are sort of rapid, migration movements that governments are seen as not having sort of authority over, or not sort of directing in some way, I think that's where there can be a real sort of detrimental political impact. I do think that having a generous and open sort of refugee policy and raising sort of caps and having a humane and generous sort of immigration policy, I do think actually those are consistent with a liberal order domestically and internationally, as long as governments can sort of show that it's within a certain framework. And earlier this year, President Biden, there was a little bit of a media furore when initially I think they refused to increase the refugee caps. I think partly because there was some concern about the domestic reaction. Then they did that, and I don't think that that's been a major political or policy problem, right? I think we can easily absorb a lot more sort of refugees and raising those caps significantly over where they were in the Trump administration. And I think the reaction of the public to that has been broadly positive. And we saw, after the Afghanistan withdrawal, a lot of support all around the country, with some exceptions, but I think overwhelming support really for a generous policy on refugees. So I think it is compatible, but I think there is a real kernel of truth in the question, which gets to that point about the perception of a lack of sort of control, or sort of, a moment of crisis, the type of which we have seen on occasion over the last decade.
Many thanks. Equally incisive to the question. Dr. Andor. Your thoughts?
Yes, I would underline in this question the word perception, because indeed the perception of uncontrolled irregular migration was instrumentalized 10 years ago at the time of the Great Slump, when the conservative liberal government pursued very heavy austerity policies. And for the consequences, they themselves thought that it's a wise idea to blame the immigrants, whether they come from the European Union or whether they come from outside. But you know, by this, they made a very counterproductive tactics, you know, spiral out of control, because through immigration, obviously, the European Union was also to blame, even if the EU does not run a laissez-faire migration policy. Even inside the European Union, when we speak about free movement, it's very conditional. And there is no transition from one welfare system to the other welfare system, which was the accusation at the time of the days of UKIP and Nigel Farage. So in a way, it was instrumentalized. And don't forget that there have been countries with much greater immigration than what we saw in the UK, Spain, Ireland. Proportionately speaking, they received much more immigrants than the UK, but they didn't instrumentalize for the wrong cause, you know, the perception, and they didn't blame the migrants for the failure of the national government. And obviously, they didn't end up the same calamity as the United Kingdom.
And looking ahead to the French election, would you feel comfortable that we've learned the right lessons from a decade of that kind of exploitation?
French election, look, whoever runs against whichever Le Pen will win. So I'm not concerned about the French election.
Right. Clear. Mr. Katz, over to you.
Yeah, I thought Tom hit many of the right notes in speaking about this issue, particularly from the U.S. perspective. I do differ that this was the one issue that sort of gave Trump the victory in 2016. There were a lot of factors. The one thing I don't think was raised here, which I think is really important, is really the addressing some of these root causes in countries where we're seeing seeing migrants come from. Which is something that the United States, including in Central America, has not been able to really address. It goes to many of the root issues that we see in terms of democratic failings or corruption, and it's something that we have a summit for democracy. This should very much be on the agenda as well when we talk about how to strengthen democracy globally, because you have a number of countries where you see migrants coming from that are obviously clearly people are leaving for a certain reason. And I think what Tom said about, at least in the United States, the context of laying out what an immigration strategy looks like. Every administration has had a real difficulty moving this through the US Congress because of political reasons, whether we talk about dreamers or we're talking about numbers or a path to citizenship. So I expect, again, with Trump likely to run again in the next presidential election, that this will become another very significant issue in the United States. And we do not see the numbers slowing down, even on the US borders. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Katz. Last but not least, Mr. Picula, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Regarding irregular migrations, I think they just triggered chain of action we analyze now, but I think one of the main consequences of the irregular migrations when appear on the scene was starting breakfast and disputes on how to handle consequences, where Hungary and some other countries opposed common solutions. But I believe problems for the European Union started earlier, during a sharp response on financial crisis from 2008 and austerity policy, which took place. I think it damaged the basic social fabric of many European countries, and damage welfare state features in many corners of the European Union, especially in the southern part of the European Union. And that made European countries vulnerable and more sensitive for future shocks like irregular migration, what was and still is an excellent issue for political manipulations. So I remember one title in the newspapers during the pandemic in connection with the irregular migrations problems for European institutions, where author said that European Union seems to be only organization for the sunny and good weather, but it's so vulnerable, so sensitive for every external shock. And that's the situation we are dealing right now, and we are still coping how to get rid of internal, we are not capable enough to handle such external shocks like irregular migrations. And of course, we are forced to compromise on many authoritarian regimes in order to calm down situation or prevent further irregular migrations. But I think the damage is already here, not in Poland only and Hungary, but in some other countries like Austria in a way. Yeah. Then Chancellor Prime Minister Kurz openly gave himself a credit, and he stopped the Western Balkan route for the migrants. Of course, coping and supporting local authoritarian politicians along the Western Balkans line. So it's still an open wound for European Union, and I'm not over-optimistic that a migrant pact as a primary expression of the common solidarity and rational response will be on the table anytime soon, unfortunately.
Thank you, Mr. Pikula. Thank you also for reminding us, as far as Europe is concerned, democratic backsliding is not only constrained to Poland or Hungary. These are perhaps the most obvious examples, but the symptoms of the democratic retreat are felt elsewhere, perhaps unevenly, but they're always present across Europe. Now, we're very close to closing. I should thank before closing our wonderful panel, Mr. Pikula, Mr. Katz, Dr. Andor, and Mr. Wright, for the concreteness, the insightfulness, and the frankness. I think that the diagnostical part is clear, but I believe you also helped us with your interventions. You helped our shared understanding, not only of what has happened, what is happening, but also of what should happen in the future. So many thanks indeed. Let me also thank once more the teams at FEPS and GMF and FEPS for all the hard work put into this. This is an excellent annual partnership going back years, and hopefully this will remain the case in the years ahead. And of course, let me thank you all for attending, submitting questions, actively participating. As always, I will leave you with a quote, and this time is a quote by Ben Franklin, a polymath and one of the founding fathers of the U.S., who once referred to democracy as two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. For all democratic citizens attending, some food for thought. Now, before closing, let me remind everyone that we'll be back shortly for the second session, which are focusing on China. So please do stay on or log back on soon. The session will start at 4 p.m. sharp Brussels time. Many thanks to all. Have a beautiful afternoon.
Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning to those of us who are in the United States at the moment. Good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe. Welcome to the second session of the State of the Unions with GMF and FEPS, dealing with a rising China. I'm Andrew Small, fellow at GMF's Asia program, usually in Berlin now, but currently in DC, enjoying the first fruits of the lifting of the travel ban this week. The basic question that we're going to be trying to answer today is what the prospects are for Europe and the United States to pull together in dealing with the challenges that China poses. But defining what that even means is a bit of a challenge too. The transatlantic China agenda has become extremely expansive, incorporating not just the more traditional efforts to coordinate approaches on China policy itself, or even wider strategy in Asia or now the Indo-Pacific, but it's also started to recondition the wider transatlantic agenda on trade, on climate, technology regulation, supply chains, industrial policy, a lot of issues that are really at the core of the domestic and international agenda on both sides of the Atlantic. We're now having a very, very different set of exchanges than we were when competing with China in these domains was a less prominent part of the equation. We have three fantastic speakers today to disentangle all of this and make sense of the Biden administration's approach, everything that's going on in Europe, and everything that's going on in between them. I'm going to introduce a couple of the speakers now. Our third speaker, Jennifer Harris, is just momentarily tied up, but she will be materializing very shortly, which means that the order that we will go in, though we will also be seeing a video before we actually kick off, we'll begin with Stephen Walt, professor at Harvard's Kennedy School, one of the world's leading international relations thinkers, and someone who's writing on this very precise topic. Most of you, I think, will have read in Foreign Policy just a few weeks ago. Our second speaker will be Thorsten Benner, co-founder and director of the Global Public Policy Institute, one of Europe and Germany's most prominent thinkers on the topic that we're dealing with as well, dealing with a rising China, and whose work on subjects such as authoritarian influence, which I know was something that was also being covered in the first session today, really helped to reshape the European debate and feed into this concept of system rivalry, systemic rivalry that the EU adopted. And I'll give the introductory remarks about Jennifer when she joins. Each of the speakers will talk for a few minutes before we have a little moderated discussion and move into the Q&A. But first of all, I believe we're all going to be entertained now by a short video. Okay, so we've had the holy trinity of competitor, partner, and rival to frame our thoughts. I'm going to hand over to Professor Walt to give his opening comments on this topic.
Terrific. Well, it's a real pleasure to be speaking to everybody today in what is probably the 1500th Zoom conversation I've had in the last year and a half or so. So as China's power has increased, so have its stated ambitions, and that's one of the reasons, I think, for growing concern. It's revised the status quo in Hong Kong. It's attempting to do so in the South China Sea, worked very hard to build influence in key international organizations. It has adopted an increasingly belligerent diplomatic style and sought to punish countries like Norway or Australia for rather minor diplomatic slights. Repression of the Uyghur minority has raised serious human rights concerns, and it hasn't lived up to prior economic agreements, although I hasten to add it is hardly the only country that plays hardball on such matters. So the question before us is, will the United States and Europe cooperate in response? It's quite clear the Biden administration values America's European partners, wants to enlist them in an increasing competition with China. I think that's entirely understandable. But I also think there are real limits to how much help Europe can or will provide, particularly in the sort of hard security domain. And that's what I'm going to focus on. Here we should start by remembering that states make serious security commitments only when they face a common threat. This is why American commitments in Asia are deepening, why states in Asia are starting to act together, again, because they share a common perception that a rising China is a potential challenge. That sense of a common threat from China is much less evident in Europe today. Now, on the one hand, European attitudes have shifted in a sharply anti-Chinese direction in recent years, really quite a dramatic set of swings. But on the other hand, I think Europeans still do not see China as a major security challenge. It's simply too far away. Issues like Russia, issues like migration, climate obviously loom larger in the European consciousness. Europeans are also, I think, eager to preserve their economic ties with China. Germany is the most obvious case here. China is now its largest trading partner, about 7% of German exports going to China. And this was nicely captured by the French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, rather recently, where he said, the United States wants to confront China. The EU wants to engage China. And I think that captures the difference rather nicely. It's also not clear to me what security assets Europe could actually contribute, apart from some occasional token naval forces that aren't going to affect the balance of power in Asia at all. Remember, we are often told that Europe cannot defend itself without lots of American help. It's hard to see what it could do to affect things in Asia to any significant degree. The recent AUKUS deal between the United States, the UK, and Australia got a lot of attention, but the details of that arrangement are still quite unclear, and it's not going to actually add any new capabilities for more than a decade. Germany has announced it's going to send 6 Eurofighters and a transport plane to participate in some exercises in Australia. But again, this is temporary, largely symbolic, unlikely to change anyone's calculations. Here's where I think it gets tricky. Europe can't stay neutral between the United States and China and at the same time expect the United States to be fully committed to its defense. So European states, I think, are going to be tempted to do the absolute minimum necessary to keep Uncle Sam happy. But that's not going to amount to very much. We'll work together on some soft diplomatic issues, human rights, digital security, WTO reform, things like that, but not on costly or risky security issues. And here, the contrast with a country like Japan is striking. Japan increasingly says Taiwan is a security interest of theirs. It's hard to imagine Europe saying the same or doing much on that front. So I conclude that the greatest contribution Europe could make would be to take greater responsibility for its own defense so that the United States can focus more attention on Asia. In other words, what's needed is a new transatlantic division of labor. I hope that happens. I think that would be good for Europe and good for the United States too. But I guess I remain skeptical that NATO or the European Union is going to play an active role balancing China, particularly in Asia. And what worries me most is that a few European states will make some token gestures in the Asia Pacific, which won't do much to affect the balance of power there, but will further dilute their capabilities in Europe. Then they're going to turn to Washington and say, now you owe us, you have to keep defending us too, which will undermine the American effort to focus more attention and resources in China. I may be wrong, though, and perhaps the other participants here can give me a reason to be more optimistic. Let me stop there and look forward to listening to the rest of the conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Torsten, can you give reasons to be more optimistic?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to the organizers for including me, and thank you, Stephen, for your initial remarks. I'm sorry I can't be really optimistic. I don't fundamentally disagree with what you said on the military part, but I think it's probably one-dimensional to say that the China challenge is just military, and that the European response then should do to take care of our own security, which we should be doing anyway, because I think regardless of what America does with China, we cannot rely on U.S. security guarantees forever. They are your friends at the Quincy Institute, and especially the progressive part of the Quincy Institute wants to get out of European security guarantees better today than tomorrow. And also some restrainers on the other side. But I do think that the China challenge is a little bit more multifaceted than the security threat side. And I think there we can play a role. And Andrew in the preparation asked me to talk a little bit about what a progressive stance could look like and couldn't look like. After all, we're co-hosted by an institute that regards itself as a progressive force in Europe. And I think progressives are quite divided on China, and I'm quite worried about some of the stances progressives take, and other stances are clearer in terms of where one can cooperate. I think it's smart for progressives to say that China is not the biggest threat to our democracies, that the biggest threats to our democracies come from within, that we've done kind of overreach of democracy promotion, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about authoritarian influence exerted by Beijing. It's smart to say that on progressives that, of course, the climate crisis is a fundamental challenge, and we should try to engage Beijing on that. But it's absolutely stupid to expect Beijing to build one fewer coal power plant just because we're silent on some of the other strategic issues we're facing with Beijing. And unfortunately, that's what some progressives on the left in the US seem to be saying. The fortunate thing in Germany is that the Green Party, or at least 90% of the Green Party, actually doesn't go for that. It wants to cooperate with China on climate change, but doesn't have any illusions about that, and doesn't want to trade other strategic issues with China on that front. I think we'll hear later a little bit more on the kind of foreign policy for the middle class agenda of the Biden administration, what that means for transatlantic China policy. I do think we compete and cooperate on industrial policy. It's progressive for progressives. I think it's smart to say what's good, at least from a German perspective, what's good for a German multinational like Volkswagen, which is partly a Chinese company now, doesn't necessarily need to be good. The kind of dependence they have on the Chinese market doesn't necessarily need to be good for Germans or German foreign policy. That's a smart progressive thing to say, and this is a smart progressive thing to say also to lessen our dependencies on supply chains, and also there's quite a bit one can do together transatlantically. Finally, on trade, I think there's also some question marks on the progressive agenda. Of course, it's good to say we focus on climate, human rights in trade deals, but in terms of the competition also with Beijing in third markets, I'm not always entirely sure. For example, like the discussion on the European Mercosur deal, whether that's always smart to go for the maximum on climate and protection while pursuing these trade deals, and given, at least in the competitive environment that we are, at least progressives need to ask themselves that question.
Thanks very much, Torsten. While we're waiting, I saw Jennifer Harris materialize and then dematerialize again. But we will, in between, I think we can just have a discussion between the rest of us, and then we'll kick in with her remarks when she joins. Torsten, I wondered if you might kind of expand on a couple of points. First of all, particularly as we're looking at now the new coalition government taking shape in Germany, which is obviously going to be so pivotal to the entire European agenda on China and so many other related questions. A lot of people have obviously been sort of waiting for this and kind of sitting out the final stages of Merkel's term. What do you think is likely to open up differently now? We're starting to get a lot more things feeding out, at least from the coalition negotiations, than we were in the early days. And what do you think in the end is likely to continue to hold back in terms of what can be done on the transatlantic front?
No, I do think what will change is that with the Greens and the Free Democrats in government, you have two parties in that coalition that are quite clear on the kind of systemic rival challenge. And I found it quite cute in the video that you played in the early days. There was in the beginning of this, and I didn't think it was a smart progressive thing to do, where it said China as a partner, China as a competitor, there was no question mark, and China as a rival, there was a question mark. I would rather say the question mark should be with China as a partner, because where exactly can we say that China is a partner? So it's not a smart progressive thing to only question the rival part, and the German government will also find it hard. I mean, Andrew, you've said that before. I mean, it's hard to say that you're a partner on Monday and a competitor on Tuesday, and on Thursday you're a strategic rival. I think the Social Democrats were quite smart in the parliamentary group's China paper last year. They actually did say that the degree of strategic rivalry or systemic competition constrains or conditions the kind of partnership and competition we have economically with China. And the German government and also the likely new chancellor Olaf Scholz would be smart to follow that. Let's see how much the kind of Greens and the FDP and also the progressive voices in the Social Democrats can push on this. I think Olaf Scholz's natural inclination, he comes from Hamburg, which is a kind of a trading city and one of the holdouts of the kind of most favorable stance vis-a-vis trade and economic relations with China these days. In Germany, his natural inclination may not be to change that much, but I think his coalition partners and also the progressives in his own government party will push for this. I think the best ally for those who want change will also be Xi Jinping, who has kind of clearly demonstrated to Angela Merkel that her kind of middle road policy, for example, on the German frigate that sailed and then offered as a token of appreciation portfolio in Shanghai, that was rejected. So I do think there's a chance we will see a somewhat more self-confident and assertive stance from Berlin. And I think at any rate, what will be pivotal and important and good for China policy is that Olaf Scholz is very committed that the new government invests in kind of Germany's and Europeans' technological kind of in innovation renewal. And that's one of the most important ingredients in kind of systemic competition with Beijing. So on that front, I think we'll see quite a positive development.
Thanks very much, Torsten. I'll come back to a couple of the questions that I also had for Stephen Walt later. We're delighted now to be joined by Jennifer Harris as well. So I think we'll go to her next. She's been writing and working on geoeconomics and economic statecraft since long before it was fashionable, and her thinking on how to connect US grand strategy with changes to the prevailing economic philosophy is not only at the core of the Biden administration's agenda, it's also now something that she's putting into effect very directly from her position at the White House as Senior Director for International Economics and Labor at the NEC. And when I talked to European officials about what the biggest move this year was in the transatlantic China space, it was not the Xinjiang sanctions or the G7 statement, but the recent 232 deal. I'm going to hand over to her to make a few comments, and then we'll go into a wider discussion between the three of you. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
And thank you. Delighted to be with you all and to be in such esteemed company on this panel. And apologies for being a bit late with technical issues. I think thanks to White House security specs making life darn near impossible. So I will be. I will aspire to be brief in my remarks. I really want to make kind of three-ish points, picking up perhaps beginning with where Andrew left off, and really making good on turning the page and some of the lingering squabbles in the economic domain with some of our closest partners and allies as a necessary first step in a China strategy that is, I think, as serious and single-minded as the Trump administration took the China challenge, but differs markedly on tactics, and especially the role that our allies and partners play. And so I think, overall, what you're seeing in the Biden administration is a kind of pragmatic, clear-eyed understanding of needing to work with the China we have and not the China we might wish we had, and kind of just not wishing the constraints that we're working under away, and trying something different than, I think, what U.S. policy by and large over the past sort of 30, 40 years on China has been characterized by, which is more or less, a belief that the international system will change China more than China will change the system, and that what follows from that is a kind of wide paved sort of series of summits where we're more or less asking China nicely and making appeals to enlightened self-interest. And I think those days are over. We are, I think, now much more about changing the strategic environment around China rather than making kind of direct appeals to Beijing, presuming to speak to Beijing's kind of enlightened self-interest. And obviously, one rate limiter for how that goes is going to be our ability to work effectively with allies and partners. And here too, I think it needs to redound to something a little more sophisticated than delivering points and demarches at a kind of level of generality that doesn't really descend into trade-offs and tactics. And so I think the first piece of what it looks like to work effectively with allies and partners is to settle kind of the disagreements between us on the view that we have more that unites us in this shared challenge we face in China's increasing sort of abuse of its power, both in the military and the economic domain, then kind of whatever our disagreements bilaterally, transatlantically amount to. So that's, I think, the logic that you saw behind settling not just the steel and aluminum tariffs, but the Boeing Airbus deal earlier this year. And kind of making a point to preview some of our thinking in kind of as we begin to move out on this iteration of an Asia pivot and the China strategy and the Indo-Pacific strategy, making sure that we are really coordinating those with our allies. And that's why the kind of sequencing, we really cared about the sequencing of, say, the first plot points that we've seen bilaterally on sort of where we're going with the U.S.-China economic negotiations in phase one, and presumably what follows after phase one. But I kind of want to sort of emphasize what we need in the kind of tenor, what needs to change in the tenor of the kind of transatlantic relationship. It's not, yes, I think we need to be willing to give more on both sides and to settle some of these longstanding grievances. But we also need to have a kind of the same clear-eyed pragmatism that we're taking with respect to China to kind of the strains in the international system. And, I would note that I think the most creative and to me interesting piece of the steel negotiations in that deal were less the kind of bilateral detente that both sides reached with sort of setting down arms and our tariffs and the global arrangement where we are for the first time using market access, predicating sort of market access on questions of carbon intensity. it was not lost on either the U.S. or I think our European partners that the steel coming out of China is not only, not adhering to market norms and the basic problem of overproduction and non-market subsidies. It's also a lot dirtier than either the steel coming out of the U.S. or the EU. And so, kind of getting, aligning climate progress with good domestic politics, and being fortunate to have the support of both U.S. industry and U.S. labor on this deal, as well as the geopolitics on the side of climate progress. It was sort of a threefer, and I think that needs to be the model for a lot of U.S.-EU cooperation going forward. But I will note that there are questions about things like W2 compatibility and what this new global arrangement looks like. It's sort of yet to be determined. A lot of it is up for the shaping. But I would submit that these institutions, these global institutions, are neither good nor bad in any kind of inherent moral compass. They are more or less useful to the practical problems that society faces at any one time. And it's hard to find two more existential challenges for the world than kind of the economic abuses and challenges posed by China and climate change. And if our institutions like the WTO are not affording the space and creativity that we need to address those challenges effectively, I think it's those institutions that need to bend and evolve rather than kind of our basic transatlantic political and geopolitical constraints. And the last thing I'd like to say is, really, I think in some ways, the most important piece of our China strategy, which is all of the domestic work that we are doing at home in the Build Back Better legislative agenda. I heard Thorsten speaking to this a bit in when I was able to join, in terms of China being a bit of an proximate cause for some of the investments that Europe is making in technology. I think the same applies to the U.S. And I think it is evidence of a new kind of intellectual paradigm. What makes for good economic management, sort of good management of the economy, and the values the economy is meant to serve, is I think being reshaped. I think society is always living within these boxes. It's important to kind of be to be self-aware about that fact, dating back to some ways the beginnings of modernity and mercantilism on through to laissez-faire liberalism at the turn of the sort of 20th century, to Keynesianism, and the way that Keynesianism was not just a kind of an imperative for getting out of the Great Depression. It was also, the strongest sort of defender against the winds of communism and authoritarianism. There was a geopolitical imperative for adopting Keynesianism as the kind of reigning intellectual currency, as much as it was a purely domestic set of considerations. Likewise with, the rise of what I would call neoliberalism, that we're largely still living with the after effects of. But I think that, we are beginning to turn the page both in the US and in Europe to whatever is sort of consensus will come after kind of the basic neoliberal priors and presumptions. And I think that is welcome. I think it's the right answer. These, like our institutions, these intellectual paradigms are neither right nor wrong. They are just more or less useful in explaining and addressing the problems we have. We have different problems, so we need a kind of a different set of presumptions. And I think it's helpful to have a set of geopolitical motivations. And in fact, I'm not sure that we've ever successfully transitioned from kind of one intellectual construct about how the economy works to another, absent a kind of set of geopolitical motivations. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I'm going to bounce back quickly with a couple more questions before all the things that will start materializing and are already materializing in the Q&A. So just back to Stephen Walt, and to kind of, in one sense, tie some of these things together. I mean, without going into an IR theory debate, the argument that one often hears is that in a competition with China, where economics, technology, a whole series of these other things that we kind of, in a sense, then moved on to talk about after your remarks, ideology even are really at the core, that Europe just now matters a lot more to the US than it used to, precisely during a phase in which kind of military balancing was the kind of abiding feature of the competitive elements of US strategy. Do I read you as being slightly dismissive about this kind of these other parts of the framework relative to the hard power agenda? Do you think this kind of additional US investment that we're now seeing in kind of lining Europe up on China is misplaced? Or are you kind of, in one sense, confining the parameters of your remarks to this kind of hard power dimension? And we can think about these other questions in other ways, but I'm curious, given the way the conversation has moved since your opening comments, how you think about some of these other dimensions of power in this in this kind of competitive struggle with China.
That's a great question. And I was, in fact, confining my remarks mostly to the hard power security dimension, where I think the United States and Europe are not going to do very much together vis-a-vis China. There'll probably be some limited stuff, but I don't think it will ultimately be very significant. And what will really matter is what happens out in Asia itself, where I don't expect Europe to play much of a security role. And this is at least a potential friction point between the United States and Europe, because I think Europeans will have to become accustomed to getting sort of less American attention than has been the norm for the last 50, 60, 70 years. Now, on the rest of the agenda, there are lots of areas where the United States and Europe actually should be actively trying to cooperate. The one that always leaps to mind for me now is the whole broad digital space, right? Where in some respects, Europeans have been more out front in trying to get a handle on what the emergence of big tech actually means and what it means for the lives of individuals, what sorts of digital standards have to be set. And this is, I think, an area now where Americans are starting to play catch up and wondering, do you really want to have a completely unregulated space? Do we need to do more to protect privacy as well? So that strikes me as an area where we are much closer to Europe than we are likely to be towards China in their views. And this is an area where, for all sorts of other economic reasons, there's going to be a lot of interchange there. So that's one. In the wake of the pandemic, public health is one where the United States and Europe did not cooperate particularly well. Nobody cooperated particularly well in responding to this. But going forward, that's an obvious area where there's no real, points of obvious conflict as well. I think the challenge, and I'll be interested in what the other panelists say about this, the challenge is how you keep an American industrial policy that is mostly focused on competing with China from generating future trade problems with other trading partners who are sometimes trading rivals and sometimes, positive sum of partners as well. I agree. I think the Biden administration has done a very good job to take some of those issues off the table immediately, but they won't stay off the table forever. If the United States is starting to do a lot more to try and stimulate technological competitiveness vis-a-vis China, that's going to eventually rebound on the relationship with other advanced economies as well and have to be managed. And that's also going to be an issue that I think progressives divide on in various ways. The progressives, at least in the United States, have been, let's say, ambivalent about free trade in any and all circumstances. Is one of the reasons you couldn't get TPP through back, 8 or more years ago. So how we're going to manage a industrial policy that's focused on primarily on China and not have that cause frictions with our European partners, I think is going to be a significant challenge going forward.
Okay, I'd be interested to hear both of the other panelists kind of responding to that actually, and one kind of additional question for related, almost the obverse of the question to Stephen Walt just then. I mean, I think there are a lot of European policymakers who have still tended, even recently, to see US-China policy through this kind of classic great power rivalry prism, struggle for primacy, containment, confrontation, and one kind of hears all of these words still slung around as the kind of by European senior level policymakers, which inclines some of them to kind of find ways to sit this out. And the president, of course, has framed it more about competition of systems, about democracies showing that they can deliver for the people, in ways that maybe sometimes European counterparts, as we saw at the Munich Security Conference, haven't always engaged with. I mean, you sit at quite a unique vantage point in the White House between the kind of economic, domestic, and international strategy. I mean, how do you see these kind of different modes of thinking driving US policy under this administration? And I wondered, I mean, and then we will go to the Q&A, and Torsten, you can jump in on this as well. I see one of the questions touches on this quite directly. I wondered if you might respond to Stephen Watt's point on this, particularly on the industrial policy question. I mean, what you expect, I mean, you talked about this a little in your opening remarks. What do you really want to see from Europe in the next year? Where are you still concerned that some of the differences on issues from CBAM to, I mean, as you mentioned, the WTO, privacy, some of these areas are still going to impose limitations, even with all the shifts that we've now seen and are seeing with this administration?
Yeah, it's a good question, and thank you for it. I think that the industrial policy example, Stephen, is fertile ground for kind of exploring some of these tensions, which to me are, call them tensions. I think I also see it as one of the kind of totemic markers or harbingers of this kind of evolution of, an economic paradigm, a consensus that it kind of gets, reshaped every generation or more around what makes for good economic policy and what are the underlying values that an economy should serve. And I think, right now, as it's shaping up, it's a recognition, whatever comes out, I don't have a proper noun for it yet, but whatever comes after the kind of consensus that most have called neoliberalism, where industrial policy has been kind of the thing that would get you kicked out of serious meetings and is now kind of making it a comeback. That is one important marker of this post-neoliberal view. Another is, I think, just a recognition of just how much power, both economic kind of market power and more political power, shapes market outcomes, and how economic power is rarely confined to the economic realm, often spills over into the political domain. And here I'm thinking about people like Paul Pearson and Jacob Hacker, and it's the stuff that allows economic actors to rig the political system in favor of their economic self-interest in a kind of snowballing, mutually reinforcing cycle, such that the answer then is to focus more on countervailing power. And you see that, I think, in the Biden administration's renewed zeal on antitrust, renewed commitment to organized labor. I think the thrust of things like HR1 and the kind of more political domain, alongside a view that market mechanisms are not going to get us where we need to be on climate. I think, even jurisdictions, like Europe, I think, would probably admit that their ETS, while it is, more ambitious than any other carbon trading scheme in the world, is still not enough. And most of the recent work on pricing carbon kind of bears that out in the academic domain. And so I think this actually is a great example of pointing to a practical problem the world has in the form of climate change that requires us to rethink our kind of biases and presumptions around the role of industrial policy. And I think the U.S., whether through political strengths or because it's actually the right answer, is stumbling towards a view of climate that is much more public investment led, subsidies led. And I think that it quickly follows from that, if American taxpayers are going to, support historic sums that we're seeing in the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better package, we're going to have a different set of rules around things like, how much of that should be understood to be, privileged for American jobs in the form of the president's commitments on things like Buy America. In point of fact, that's really patching up our procurement system to be much more on par with, the way of most of our G7, G20 peers. But I do think it comes from a place of the U.S., doing, far and away the lion's share of stoking global aggregate demand. And then the question is, what do the politics demand domestically in return for that? And I think that is a version of climate progress that is just going to require, a different attitude on things like the WTO. I think, and so I would ask, to be very direct, Andrew, to your question of what does the U.S. need from our European friends. I think flexibility on tactics. I think we all share the same goal, at least in the question of climate, but we need a little bit more flexibility, which we've said, for 20 years now, as long as I've been doing this, that, we need to respect kind of different political systems and the constraints therein in terms of how we each get towards progress. But I think it's time that we need to mean it now. Thanks.
Thanks very much. So that, I think, goes straight to Torsten then on those two kind of Jen Harris's final point, Stephen Walt's question, and one of the questions that I see in the Q&A. So to Stephen Walt's question, I mean, how far do you see some of these areas and in a sense parts of the agenda that Jennifer Harris was talking about? How do you see the kind of you still see kind of reactions in certain bits of Europe, like, this is protectionism, or this is I mean, how far do you see the capacity to really have some degree of tactical flexibility around these issues as was suggested, or how far do you think we are going to run into collisions on some of these things? And to the question that I see here in the Q&A, shouldn't the competition between authoritarian states focus on strengthening the economic situation of the middle class in our societies? The West won the Cold War because of the promise of a better life as well. Build Back Better, strengthening resilience against authoritarian tendencies. I mean, how far do you get a European version of the foreign policy for the middle class agenda in the context of this, and how compatible is that with US efforts in that regard? I wonder if you might comment on some of those questions, Torsten.
Yeah, thank you. I think this can only work if we're honest that to the degree that transatlantically we can cooperate, we do so as competitors, economic competitors. And of course, industrial policy and the foreign policy for the middle class is not the foreign policy that Jennifer is pursuing. It's not the foreign policy for the European or the German middle class. It's the foreign policy for the US middle class, and that's fine. We can deal with it, but we shouldn't have any illusions about it. But I had a meeting earlier today with a senior State Department official on economic affairs. He was in town. I do think there's some smart thinking in terms of how we can kind of prevent a race to the bottom of everybody reshoring everything domestically, but to also have kind of resilient supply chains among kind of like-minded allies with a fair division of labor, where we talk about these things, the kind of competition of industrial policy. For sure, we cannot have what the US has tried to pull on Europe to sell Open RAN, for example, as the best thing to bolster the security against the likes of Huawei, and whereas it is a big kind of industrial policy ploy to kind of make sure Nokia and Ericsson are no longer the leading voices in this industry, but that American companies that so far haven't been able to compete in this market are able to compete in the next generation of 5G and 6G and so on. So those things, if the Center for New American Security tries to tell me that's in my security interest to support that agenda, I say thank you, but let's think again about let's think again about that. But to the question by Stefan Liebig, you said and Stefan was until very recently the local member of parliament representing the constituency in which I'm sitting now, and he's doing a great project now for the left party's Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in the US, and he's one of the leading voices in the left party for a sane version of left party foreign policy. And it's a good question, but I don't think it's an either or. Of course, we should focus on strengthening the middle class in our societies, but that has nothing to do with China necessarily. We should do that because otherwise I think our democracy will not survive. And I think much of the kind of foreign policy for the middle class in the US is motivated by exactly that. It's good for the middle class, it's good for US democracy. I think the China bit comes in as the kind of thing, you know, we need to kind of shape up if we want to compete. Plus, it's one thing that some Democrats and some Republicans can agree on in the US. So it's also a bit of an instrumental use of this, which I think some, for good reasons, see also having some negative sides. But I do think we need to do everything that Stefan Liebig is saying, but it's not an either or. But we should still then compete vigorously with Beijing and other authoritarian states. But I think we can do that competition much more kind of confidently if we have a middle class or like a lower class or lower middle class that believes in the system of democracy delivering for them. And if we believe in the ability of our democracy not to just defend itself, but also to innovate and change. So I do think it's a good point, but it's not an either or. We should be doing that and all the other things that we talked about in the competition of systems.
Okay, thank you. Pivoting to precisely the opposite kind of angle on this, and in a sense, going back to some of the opening comments, there's the question from Oscar Krabbe on which role could NATO play in addressing the rise of China? Is NATO even relevant when it comes to China? Is this an example of one of the areas which, I mean, has been clearly pushed on the US side, the kind of China appearing on the NATO agenda in the last 2 or 3 years? Is this kind of misplaced? Should our energies be rather kind of spent on some of these other areas that we've been discussing? I wondered if anyone wants to comment on that. Perhaps Stephen, this might be sort of playing into precisely what you'd been talking about in terms of the role that NATO should actually play.
Yeah, in that. I don't want to repeat my opening remarks, but I don't think NATO is going to play a substantial role. If you think of NATO as primarily a military alliance, a collective security pact, because I don't think China at this point poses a direct security threat to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And I think that those countries in Europe are primarily focused on European security questions for which China is not sort of immediately and directly engaged. Do I think there's going to be zero cooperation? No, there's going to be some discussions of cybersecurity issues and things like that. And you will get the occasional, British or French ships sailing through the South China Sea. But I think these are pretty much symbolic acts, and I already laid that out. I thought Thorsten's remarks actually were very interesting and right on the money. And I did want to just echo a couple of points there and then say one other thing the United States should stop doing. Foreign policy people like me tend to focus a lot of attention on what's happening out there in the world and think it's very significant. I think in terms of competition with China, what happens inside China, what happens inside the United States, what happens inside European countries will ultimately matter much more. Which of these countries ends up dominating key technologies, having market share for that reason? Which of these countries is more politically unified and able to act decisively to deal with future challenges. That's going to matter much more than what happens in some far-flung corner of the world. And what's really ironic, and I'm not going to give a campaign speech for the Biden administration, but what is really ironic here is what they are trying to do is actually a win-win. Right? It's one of those rare cases where there isn't really a guns butter trade-off. In fact, by doing things better at home, you'll compete more effectively with China and Americans will lead better lives. And why that's not sort of obvious to more people baffles me a little bit as well. The one thing the United States needs to, I think, stop doing is exploiting its market power, particularly in the realm of finance. And here I'm talking about the American tendency to slap financial sanctions on anyone it doesn't like, and even on some countries, or at least threatening to do so on countries that it does like. The use of secondary sanctions, denying people or denying firms access to the SWIFT system and things like that, I think has poisoned relations with our European partners in some unfortunate ways in the past, and encourages them, along with others, to start thinking of ways of trying to be less dependent on a financial system where the United States is still by far the biggest player. I think ultimately that's a long-term loser for the United States. And so in some respects, behaving with greater restraint in terms of that particular advantage that we have would go a long way too.
Another question that I'd be interested if Jennifer Harris might comment on. I mean, in one sense, the Trump administration did not kind of OFAC and U.S. Treasury were sort of held their fire on China to a degree that many other bits of the administration did not, on China specifically. I wondered if this kind of piece of the agenda in general might be interesting to get comments on. But I see this question as well. Jake Sullivan has described U.S. policy towards China as coexistence rather than containment. How flexible might U.S. be in coexistence? I wondered if it might be possible to comment on that a bit. What is the space on the cooperative side now with China? And going back to kind of Torsten's original point, I mean, you are getting this kind of angle from certain. I mean, you saw the big joint statement from various progressive groups on climate that kind of also seen kind of pushed back quite hard from the administration, that and we've seen China trying to instrumentalize this as well, saying that cooperation on climate, for instance, is contingent on better atmosphere elsewhere, and these sorts of things every time Wang Yi speaks. I wondered if you might comment on that, Jen, on both the kind of what now the areas of the limited areas of cooperation look like, and how far some of this kind of attempt on the Chinese side and from certain political groupings as well to say that some of these areas of cooperation are contingent on better atmospherics elsewhere, and how far that kind of plays into the administration's thinking.
Thank you. I think we have to coexist. That hopefully goes without saying. And the question is, what is the surest footing we can put ourselves on to ensure that competition doesn't spill over in unintended, undesirable ways. I think that's part of a lot of the U.S.'s public and private signaling to China, and I think you will continue to see that sort of polished and sharpened and made clear and built out in the coming weeks and months. You are right that I think the most obvious area for cooperation has to be climate change, and it is unfortunate that our Chinese friends have tried to, link that to their interests elsewhere, and we have made clear that that's just not on the table. When we're talking about the sort of shared fate of humanity, we're not going to allow policy to be comported that way, and that's why I think we really have to be clear-eyed in shaping the environment around China. Thus far, a lot of the climate work has been somewhat in the business of kind of asking nicely of China and sort of seeing how much progress that can afford. But I would again point to things like the steel and aluminum deal as yes, it's important on its own terms. That's a vitally important sector, but I think it's also just illustrative of a different way of operating and thinking, transatlantically on exactly questions like how best do you shape the environment around China and incentivize it towards the progress that I think we need to see on climate in ways that are different from just asking nicely. We're getting to predicate market access on getting China to clean up its act in some of the dirtiest steel aluminum production in the world. So that's what, sort of speaking for myself, I think we could stand to do a lot more of. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks so much. We are kind of just at the end of this now. I think we probably have time, we were going to run for an hour just for some kind of quick concluding thoughts from everyone. There's a couple of questions that were actually directed at Stephen Moore, if he wants to comment on them, either the Russia question or the BRICS question in the concluding remarks. Then I'll go to Torsten and then to Jennifer Harris to give some kind of concluding thoughts on the discussion on the panel.
Okay, very, very quickly on the Russia question, to what extent the United States is willing to reach a compromise with Russia, I don't see that in the cards anytime soon. I do think a greater effort ought to be made to try and lower the temperature with Moscow, but that itself is a tricky problem, and I don't think it's going to be high enough on the administration's agenda here. In terms of wrapping up, I agree entirely with what Jennifer said, that coexistence is not just desirable, it's unavoidable. The United States is not going to put China out of business, and China is not going to put the United States out of business. So we are coexisting, I think, by definition. I think to try and manage what is going to be a relationship where cooperation is necessary on certain issues, but where there is an intense competition for power going on, it would be helpful for the United States and China to try and group the various issues that they have to address into sort of three boxes. And the first box would be trying to reach agreements on some red lines, on things we won't do to each other, that we're not going to question each other's legitimacy. We're not going to engage in efforts to undermine the domestic stability on the other side as well. And you can think of other things where we ought to agree that there are certain actions we're not going to take towards each other, including in the economic realm. Then there'd be a second box where are issues that are up for negotiation. And the economic relationship is one of those. What are going to be the actual parameters and dimensions of economic exchange between the United States and China? What give and take is involved there? Are there issues where we might be willing to compromise on something in order to get a compromise from China? So that's sort of a second box where we have mutual negotiations and adjustments. And then a third box is the areas where we're not going to be able to agree. Each of us is going to act unilaterally to protect our interests, but could we at least have an understanding that those unilateral actions will be proportionate, that we won't be using them to gain an additional advantage or to escalate a conflict. We won't be using a unilateral action in one realm to try and hurt China in some other realm, and vice versa. And that seems to me a useful framework to trying to think through how to manage a relationship that will be inherently competitive at its core, but has to retain as many elements of cooperation as we can.
Thank you. Torsten.
Yeah, thank you. It was interesting, you mentioned on the cooperation side. I do think I was pretty shocked that even Joe Nye, who talks about smart power in a recent New York Times op-ed, just regurgitated this Wang Yi line that we cannot isolate climate change from other strategic issues, and said like, oh, we have to cooperate, and we really need to listen to what Wang Yi has to say. I thought he was smarter than that, and I think we all need to smarten up and not to fall into this trap. Fraser Cameron's question on containment versus cooperation, coexistence. Of course, it will be coexistence, as Stephen has argued very eloquently. The Federation of German Industries, very interestingly, has recently put out a paper labeled responsible coexistence. So it's kind of what's the responsible way of different systems coexist, and I can very much recommend that in this systemic competition context. I do disagree with, I mean, it would be desirable to have these three buckets, Stephen, but I can assure you that on the first bucket, this kind of red line, not to question the legitimacy and domestic stability, Beijing will, as long as the Communist Party stays in power, they will never believe the US government that it's not out to delegitimize them and to kind of undermine the stability of their rule. That's the very essence of who they are, how they felt. I mean, I can only recommend Rush Doshi's The Long Game book, where you can see that even during the heydays of engagement, where we thought we're nice, smartening up, nice in the mid 90s, Beijing was talking about a new type of Cold War forming, and the US government just pretending it's engaging while it's trying to undermine it. And you can see that I don't think this will work. Responsible coexistence also means that we need to, and I think that's what the debate in the coming years will focus on much more, need to kind of, because we can count ourselves lucky if this stays a Cold War and doesn't turn into a hot war. I think we'll discuss ways and strategies to make sure that there's no military conflict between China and the US over Taiwan in the future. And I think Europe has a role to play. I have a piece, a little plug, I have a piece in Foreign Policy on this very point, how Europe can make a contribution to non-military deterrence of Beijing to keep the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. I think we'll talk about, while we've talked in the past quite a bit about how the Cold War was would be between China and the US. It's not a sensible frame maybe, but the more kind of pressing concern, I think, will also be deterrence to make sure that we don't stumble into a hot war with China in the coming years. And Europe doesn't necessarily have a military role to play, but we do have, need to act united on that front.
Thanks very much, Torsten. I remember then Vice President Biden laying out the concept of responsible competition. In fact, many years before the BDI started talking about responsible coexistence. Closing words for Jennifer Harris.
Thank you. I really broadly agree with everything that Stephen and Thorsten just said, so I won't belabor it, but I just want to come back to, I think, the point that Stephen said best to close us here, which is that far and away the most powerful determinants of how the contest and competition with China turn out are going to happen within our respective borders in the US and in Europe and to some degree in China. And so just speaking to what we have some greater agency over in the US domestic context, that is why it's incredibly important that we pass legislation to do the economic revitalization that we need in hopes that goes some measure towards healing our politics. And then I think, we have to do that revitalization kind of clear-eyed with the politics that we have. And I think that does argue for a public investment heavy theory of things like climate progress and economic progress more generally. And, I sort of commend a piece yesterday in the New York Times about how to turn red states green, noting, a lot of sort of Republican political leadership, how they've softened their stances on climate change as, sort of EV battery and EV car plants have moved into their jurisdictions. I think that's right. And I think we need to see more of it. And I think to the extent that our international norms and obligations are getting in the way of that, we need to sort of create a new consensus that understands the strategic imperative transatlantically of fixing that so that we can tend to our respective backyards, heal our politics, become unified in the way that is necessary to confront the China sort of competition over the longer haul. So thank you all.
Thanks a lot. That's a fantastic way to finish. And as hoped, panelists were able to stitch together all the different complex dimensions of the transatlantic China agenda. Huge thanks to our three speakers, Stephen Walt, Thorsten Benner, and the just rushed off to more White House tasks, Jennifer Harris. Thanks to all of you for joining and your excellent questions. I believe there are now more discussions to come, and we at GMF will continue to work closely on the transatlantic China agenda in various guises as well. So stay tuned for all of that. Thanks all of you very much.